International cooperation has been a key factor on mitigating the impacts of the pandemic. So let's talk about technical and scientific cooperation in many areas now. To moderate our next panel, we are going to welcome journalist Andres Schipani, who is the correspondent in Africa for the Financial Times. Hi, Andres. Good morning.
Hello, Caroline. How are you? Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm very fine. Thank you very much. Where are you now? It's difficult to keep up your track because you are always traveling and covering elections.
Yeah, I was covering the elections in Tanzania, but I came back to Nairobi a couple of days ago.
Perfect. And did the work went well?
Yes, it did. It was very tricky, but very interesting.
Nice, Andres. Well, we are just about to start the panel talking about international cooperation, technical and scientific cooperation. I don't know if you have any personal thoughts to start to share with us while we are waiting for our panelists.
Well, thank you. I think a certain level of international cooperation has been a key factor, as we saw in sort of like easing cushion the strongest impacts of the pandemic. But I think that what we're going to try and unlock in this panel is like, can we have more of that, please? And I think we have all the panelists already in.
Very nice.
But we have a stellar panel. That we have a stellar panel to do this with Jennifer Blake of the African Risk Capacity Insurance Company, Amit Thakker of Africa Health Business and of the African Healthcare Federation, Julie Makani of the Muhimbili University of Health and Allied Sciences in Tanzania, and Adriana Abdenur of CIPÓ in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you to all the panelists for being here.
Thank you very much, Andres, and thank you to all the panelists. I think we're ready to go with all the panelists on the screen right now, because if Andres is saying okay, then you can start, Andres. Thank you very much. I'm going to be following you up from here.
Thank you very much, and a reminder to the audience that they can send questions to you for the last 15 minutes of the session, Caroline. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We are going to be able to put some questions by the end.
Thank you very much. So again, Jennifer, Amit, Julie, and Adriana, thank you very much for being here. Let me start with throwing a question to all of you, and let's make this happen. So, as we said, we've seen some cooperation to some extent in some fronts in the pandemic. For example, I mean, at the FT, as Caroline was saying, I am now the East and Central Africa correspondent for the Financial Times, but I was until a couple of months ago the correspondent in Brazil. And I remember writing back in April about how Addis Ababa became a key hub for funneling medical equipment to Latin America during the pandemic, because some of the equipment that was coming from China was being seized either in the US or in Europe during stopovers, and Ethiopian Airlines played a key role in shipping it to Latin America. But that was on one of the positive aspects. But let's say on the negative aspects, one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic had laid bare was the extent of populist leaders around the world on how they had taken a stance against science. In the US, in Brazil, in Tanzania, where I was until this weekend. I think my question to you all is like, Jennifer, we can start with you, is how can we use this pandemic to say, make science great again on every front, not just health, but the environment, agriculture, infrastructure, and so on?
Look, I mean, I think you already said it in terms of the fact that these things that we're seeing now are not new. The inequalities were there, the difficulties of getting things where they needed to go were there, but the pandemic has laid bare a lot of this. And unfortunately, as you say, some of the reactions have not been the ones that we would have hoped to see. And to make science great again, and I would say to make technical cooperation great again, I think it's always been great, and it's always been something that I think countries would want. And why? So in one of my past lives, I was responsible for the Global Competitiveness Report at the World Economic Forum. And if you look at what it takes to make a country competitive, productive, obviously you have to have all the stuff we know in place, like education, et cetera. But as you get higher on the value chain, it really is about technology and technological transfer. It's about innovation. If you look at Africa and you think about industrial revolutions, Africa's missed parts of the past industrial revolutions. And so if you think about whether you call it the fourth industrial revolution or whatever it is that we're living through right now, there's a massive, massive opportunity for leapfrogging for Africa. And so, just to close, I'd say my hope is that given, the struggle that we're all facing, and in some ways there's populism, in some ways we're united, there's an understanding of how incredibly powerful technological cooperation, science will be going forward in order to get everybody up to the same level, and so that we stop seeing these inequalities, and also on the sustainability front that we do this in the right way going forward. Thanks, Andres.
Thank you very much, Adriana. What about you? I have a technical problem with the sun coming out, so let's change setting. But Adriana, meanwhile, what do we need? What can we do?
Well, I think it's, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I think it's a very opportune moment for us to ponder the problems of the present and the past, but also opportunities for the future, as Jennifer noted. From the perspective of the Brazilian experience, what we have to keep in mind is that South-South cooperation and Africa as a whole, they are by no means at the top of the agenda of the Brazilian foreign policy at the moment. In fact, Brazilian foreign policy is entirely geared towards alignment with the Trump family. We'll see how that plays out in the next few hours.
I think you said it right. There's a Trump family.
It is. It's a very personalistic, but highly concentrated. And as a result of this, all of the structures, the know-how that was built up over 6 decades, because the first Brazilian technical cooperation with African countries started in the late 60s. It hasn't completely been dehydrated, but it's been weakened from especially the direction of the federal government. So I think it's up to civil society, the private sector, and subnational governments at the moment to keep this conversation alive and to think about not only the successes of the past, and we have had many successes in terms of, Brazil-Ethiopia cooperation, Brazil-Guinea-Bissau cooperation, but also the massive failures. And here, infrastructure, which is the area that I'm focusing on, is an area that has to be reassessed because, as we know, some of the major infrastructure projects carried out in African countries by Brazilian conglomerates ended up fueling even more corruption and socioeconomic impacts that were very negative. And once we are able to take up this the formal cooperation channels again, we're not going to be back in the same context that we were in 5-10 years ago. There are geopolitical changes. China is a major factor, but it's not the only one. We have climate and science denialism. We have the rise of nationalist populism, countries turning inward even more as a result of the pandemic. So we need to think about what are the strategic structures through which technical and scientific cooperation between Brazil and African societies, even more broadly than states, can take place.
Thank you. Amit, what do you think? How can we bring back scientific cooperation and technical to the forefront, or boost it if you want to?
Mute. Now you can hear me, I hope.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andreas, and thanks to the organizers to have me on this panel. I don't think there's a better opportunity than the pandemic to bring science in the forefront of leadership. I think we should create a science leadership scorecard globally. And this scorecard should actually be tracked over time, because science believes in evidence, and what gets documented gets actually proven. Otherwise, it's a talk shop, whether it's on any media channel or it's any conference. And on political stage, leaders have a very nice way, and politicians have a nice way of discussing something, whether it's to do with prayers, religion, whether it's to do with firing some scientists, whether it's to hiring somebody else. But I think what the scientists need to do is to literally have a scorecard. And the scorecard must be measured over the next 5 to 10 years. Otherwise, we will be discussing this again in a decade. What should we do for science and politics? We should have more evidence. This scorecard, like SDG or MDG, should be focused and it should measure 3 or 4 areas. Let me explain, and it might help to put this. One is we should talk about managing a pandemic. And when you manage a pandemic, you never get to know in the first 2 months or 3 months or whether it's spring, fall. We should manage the pandemic and work out the scoring system and looked at the lives lost or a possible averted saved lives or, daily adjusted living, DALIs, and all those that you've heard of. And that can be done over about 2 years' time. The second thing is economic turnaround because of science. Did you literally have an impact in your economy and you balanced lives and livelihoods? So the lives and livelihoods balance requires leadership. And the third, I would say the scorecard should be, have you used the crisis as an opportunity in your country just to garner votes or the political stage? Or did you use this as an opportunity to strengthen health systems, to improve supply chain management? Did you manage to make more manufacturing happen? Did you change the lives of the next generation? So I think the crisis to opportunity is where smart leadership through science and knowledge will take place. And I'm just giving you some ideas where I think that it cannot be solved in a year or two, but a systematic science leadership scorecard. I'd love to see that.
Thank you, Amit. I mean, and you hit a critical point, I think. Brazil, for example, it's a case in point. I mean, the popularity of President Jair Bolsonaro rose during the pandemic because he was giving away cash transfers. But now the big question mark is that going to be used also to strengthen the health system, which is already pretty good, but still. So, and also bring back science to the forefront, which was quite battered in Brazil over the past few months. So, Julie, you're a scientist. Amir was talking about evidence, which is crucial for any scientific development. So how can we, again, bring all these scientific and technical cooperation to the forefront to help us and future generations? Hello, Julie? Oh, there you go.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to make a couple of points. The first is that one of the really interesting things about Brazil-Africa cooperation, and this is coming from the perspective of Tanzania, is one of the strengths that Brazil has in developing cooperation is that they only export expertise that they already have. It's very unusual for them to say that we don't have a successful health program or we don't have a successful economic program, but we will lend expertise. And I think that's something that's really striking when it comes to corporations, particularly whether they're bilateral or multilateral. So we had started discussion with Brazil as Tanzania to look at cooperation in the area of sickle cell disease, which touches on 2 key areas. One is health sciences, and the other one is genomics and data. And all of these 3 areas, I should say, are really pertinent for sickle cell disease, which is the area that I work in, but also very pertinent for pandemics such as COVID-19. And this is what I mean. When you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, I think the expectation from many, many people, especially or in addition to modelers, was that the expectation was that countries in Africa, such as Tanzania, would see a huge, huge public health impact of COVID-19. Fortunately, this is not the case. And I think there has been quite a lot of disappointment. When you look at the sensationalist headlines, there's been disappointment in that there hasn't been such a big public health impact of COVID-19 in Africa. I think the factors that are responsible for this are not known. All of us are learning quite a lot about COVID-19. From the perspective of human genetics, we've been particularly interested in looking to understand what are the human genetic factors that may influence susceptibility or protection against COVID-19. From the perspective of the viral genome, I think there's a lot of work that's ongoing, including from countries in Africa, where they're working to sequence the viral genome in order to understand, could this be one of the factors that has contributed to a lower prevalence of the disease? So that's one aspect when you look at genomics in the perspective of human and viral genomics. When it comes to data science, I think one of the key critical issues that has affected not just countries such as Tanzania, but has affected countries such as the UK, the US, which have a lot of resources, is the capacity to test. And when you look at the capacity to test and you look at the different metrics that have been used to quantify or to report, this ranges from positivity rate to the number of tests per 100,000 individuals, and it's very, very variable. But the ultimate message is that all the countries have not, very few countries, I shouldn't say all countries, but very few countries in the world have capacity to test in the way that we should be testing in a pandemic such as this. We shouldn't be testing isolated or contract. We should, in an ideal situation, be testing almost anybody, because this is a pandemic, and the definition of a pandemic is that this is the case. Now, when it comes to testing and the data that are being generated, I think you can make a decision, whether you're a country like Tanzania, where you can say our testing capacity is suboptimal, and therefore we are choosing not to share tests that we know are suboptimal, or you can report. Doesn't matter what the capacity of the testing is in terms of the number of tests that you can do per day, or the quality of the test that you can still report. And I think for most people who work in data science, as you know, there's a whole message about data in, garbage in, garbage out. So I think we have to be really concerned about the data that are being generated. The final thing is with regards to the response, and the quintessential questions or argument has been, what is the health impact of COVID-19 and what is the economic impact of COVID-19? And unfortunately, there has been a polarized approach to this whole issue. And so whether, if you have an economic approach to it, you will then rail against lockdown. Whereas if you have a health response to the pandemic, you would really say the only effective, or one of the few effective ways that we have is really lockdowns. So I think this has resulted in a situation where the scientists, from the perspective of not really knowing what happens with the virus, what happens in certain populations, they're having to come up with estimates, they're having to come up with models that have been proven to be, in some instances, not accurate. And so in terms of the cooperation, I think the really important thing here is that, one, this emphasizes, all of us have said, it emphasizes the importance of cooperation, learning from each other. And what COVID-19 has done is demonstrated that there isn't anybody who is more knowledgeable than others, because we're all learning very quickly and at the same time. I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll come back in terms of, again, to have a discussion as to what would be the way forward when it comes not just to preparing or making sure that we've learned important lessons from this pandemic, but also trying to address other conditions that countries such as Tanzania are facing, whether it's sickle cell disease, whether it's diabetes or cancer. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. We'll come back to you on infectious diseases. But Amit, let me come back to you for a second on something that Julie was saying about these sort of like polarized approaches. Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, for example, they have very strong healthcare industries. They have very big laboratories. They're able to produce drugs and vaccines and so on and so forth. So, which is a capacity that most countries in Africa don't have. How can we strengthen that sort of cooperation? I mean, I know it's a sensitive thing right now. You can say, okay, like Brazil said, okay, if we develop the vaccine, we'll first use it in Brazil and then export it to other countries in Latin America before exporting to Africa, for example. But how can we sort of like be prepared for if Brazil and Mexico and Argentina said, okay, we have the capacity to produce X amount of millions of vaccines. How can we actually be, in a way, a guiding light for the developing world and sort of like exporting and sort of like fostering more of that cooperation that could save lives?
Yeah, of course. Look, business and cooperation and bilateral relationship is built over time. Let's agree it doesn't happen in one instance. If you look at the health relations of Africa with Latin America, I would say more needs to be done. Not because of pandemic.
Amit? I think we lost him. Hello, Amit?
We can try to
Hello?
reconnect Amit in a few moments, Andres. Yeah. Please go
okay,
ahead.
Amit, so Jennifer, let me jump onto you then, because it also applies to agriculture, which is key, because it will also be in terms not only of feeding people, but also climate change and the advance of their certification. So I've seen scientific cooperation and technical cooperation, for example, in agriculture between Nigeria and Brazil. I saw it on the ground in Nigeria, the projects in Tanzania, projects in Ethiopia. Some of those have been wrapped up and they're not working anymore, but some of them are still to bear fruit. But can we see more of that?
I think absolutely. And we are seeing a lot of it. You know, there's organizations like Embrapa and Campo that are working hard with African institutions in order to ensure that we learn the best of the good and the bad things that happened in the Cerrados in terms of producing, for example, soybean. And, you know, often this can be not just soya, but it can be sort of rotational crops, as well as poultry, high protein, which is very important for Africa. But maybe even taking a step back, why does this matter? You know, which kind of goes back to your first question. I mean, if I think about the issues that people are really worried about right now, the pandemic, which obviously has taken a lot of this conversation already, it's probably like you can't almost think about anything else. But the other thing, especially in Africa, but it's also a big issue in Brazil and many other countries, is jobs, and especially jobs for young people. And so, you know, if you look at where you're going to put your resources for cooperation, technical cooperation, all of these things require resources. And in a place like Africa or Brazil, but especially Africa, where you have limited resources and everything is a trade-off, it seems to me health right now is very prevalent in people's minds, and it's certainly a place where they want to do more, but also agriculture. Why agriculture? I mean, I was talking a little bit about the savannas, you know, first of all, because productivity in many parts of Africa is still at levels, pre-industrial levels in agriculture, and that's just unacceptable. If you look at the huge imports, you know, we're talking about 50 billion US dollars in imports of food into Africa every year, despite the fact that Africa has about 60% of the world's unused arable land. That makes no sense. Now, Brazil was facing similar situations at different points. I mean, what were you going to do with the Cerrados? You couldn't even give that land away. And yet these brilliant farmers somehow managed to adapt, say soy and others, to be able to work in these areas. This is hugely powerful for Africa, and not just the crops themselves, but also the methods. And so you were talking about, you know, climate change and issues, you know, like in Brazil, in Africa, it's in your face all the time. You cannot get away from it. You know, it's a huge struggle. And actually the company that I sit on the board of, ARC, is all about trying to help African countries to adapt to, you know, these sort of disaster risks, which are increasing and increasing and increasing. So how do you deal with that? Again, learning from what Brazil did well, and also very honestly, what the mistakes Brazil made, the criticisms that maybe Brazil faced, so that you don't make those same mistakes, that you protect the soil, that you protect the communities. And so I'd say, you know, hugely important. And then the last thing I would say, just because, again, you know, in a world of limited resources, this needs to make sense. It needs to create jobs. It needs to be good for the economy. It has to also come with investment. And so I think, you know, something that we've seen, and I've been, you know, physically to the Africa-Brazil Forum in the past, Africa is a very interesting investment opportunity for many Brazilian businesses. And, you know, if you look at the capacity, the jobs that are being exported because we're importing so much food into Africa, this is a huge investment opportunity going forward. By some estimates, you know, in the next 10, 15 years, a $1 trillion business. So science matters when it's going to unlock that kind of potential. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Adriana, Jennifer mentioned something critical, which is investment. How can we sort of like wrap it into a sort of like, how can there be more cooperation between Africa and Latin America in terms of green transition, especially in infrastructure? I mean, Africa lacks a lot of infrastructure. I'm sorry, Brazil as well. I mean, the BR-163, which is the main artery to deliver soya beans to the world, it's, I mean, last time I was there, it was a bit in shambles, and it was not very long ago. So how can we move this and take these investments into infrastructure that will have a green transitioning. And especially now that Africa and both Africa and Latin America, we see increasing presence of China financing and building infrastructure.
Thank you, Andres. That's a great question. I think that given not only the pandemic context, but also the intensification of climate change, as it's been documented by the IPCC and by scientists, means that we have no option other than to think and plan for a green recovery and a green transition. And we can see that this discussion is taking place in some parts of the world. Sadly, here in Brazil, we are lagging behind. There are some civil society entities that are trying to explore the different pathways, but not so much with Africa. And I think part of the problem is that technical cooperation and scientific cooperation between Brazil and African countries has been very one-sided. It's true, as Julie has mentioned, that Brazil tends to take what its leaders perceive as being successful abroad. That doesn't always reproduce the same kinds of results because it's not adapted to local conditions. But what we are not good at is learning from African states. And I think in this issue of energy transition and climate action and adaptation, we actually have a lot to learn from individual African countries, but also from arrangements of cooperation and frameworks that are being built around the African continent and which we still lack here in Latin America. So let me give you an example. Even though the Great Green Wall that has been led, especially by Senegal, still has a very long way to go, it constitutes a really remarkable, very ambitious project. I call that green infrastructure. And I think that, civil society here in Brazil is starting to realize that keeping forests standing and fighting desertification through cooperation projects also constitutes infrastructure. We need to stop thinking about infrastructure as only large cement-based projects and look at real innovations that are taking place in other parts of the world. And of course, since there is a big demand for infrastructure, energy, transportation on both sides of the South Atlantic, there are many different areas in which cooperation and exchanges of lessons learned can take place. So for instance, environmental impact assessment. We've had this, but we've also had some drawbacks. How do we push this forward? And especially given that, as you point out, new actors have come in that have really altered the ecology of institutions involved in international cooperation around infrastructure. We have, for instance, China's Belt and Road Initiative. We have the so-called parallel institutions that exist outside of the UN system and where China also plays a very big role. Here I'm thinking about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but also the BRICS New Development Bank, which already plays a role in parts of Africa, but also
and has a Brazilian president.
Yeah, exactly. So the context is changing very much. New opportunities are coming up, but also new risks. And I think the dialogue between Latin America more broadly and African states can be very rich because there are opportunities, because, for instance, there are new sources and forms of finance, but also new risks. And some of those risks entail environmental impact, labor impact, others involve indebtedness, right? Whether we're talking about state level indebtedness, and which is typically not taken into account when these development banks assess individual projects, although the Belt and Road has now begun to talk about doing this, which would be a major step forward. And then, of course, I'm picking on China here, but it's because some of the practices are different and because the scale and the speed in which resources pour in for infrastructure are very different. They happen very quickly, and these are massive amounts. So, of course, this provokes reactions on the part of other states, especially when the geopolitical and geoeconomic rivalry comes into play. And so my final point here is that We can see this especially with respect to digital infrastructures, right? Where there's a tug of war between China and the United States, especially with respect to the 5G infrastructure. And this is being felt not only in Latin America, but also in many African states. Why aren't we talking and exchanging experiences so that we can make choices and plan for the future? I think there's a wealth of possibilities across all of these different types of infrastructure. But again, climate is a transversal topic because it will affect all of these elements, whether we're talking about financing, digital infrastructure, green infrastructure, or old-fashioned cement-based infrastructure.
But also health and conflict and so on and so forth. As for example, we have seen Nigeria and Somalia. Amit, before going back to you, let me build on something that Adriana said to us. Julie, definitely, I cannot agree more with Adriana that we have a lot to learn from African experiences. I mean, even before moving here, I remember every time I was coming to Africa, to several countries in Africa, one of the first things they were doing was like put a thermometer to your head when you get off the plane. And now that's happening everywhere, but it wasn't, because you were very good. Africans were very used to early responses because previous epidemics and so on and so forth. So, Julie, how can we all benefit from a more broader, let's say, application of health research to protect us from infectious diseases and things that you in Africa have learned more than probably my Latin American counterparts?
Thank you. So before I get to your question, Andres, what I would like to do is build on what Adriana has said in terms of investment. And I would like to give examples and opportunities of investment in three areas. One in the health sector, one in academia and research, and then the third is the digital infrastructure. And one of the points that has been made is how different partners have come into this space and what African countries have done. So as an example, within the health sector, in Tanzania, you have investment with development of centers of excellence for health. There's the Jakaya Kikwete Cardiac Institute, which has been funded by partners from China. We have the MNH Center of Excellence in Loganzila, which has been funded by partners in Korea. And what this has done in Africa, it has reduced significantly the health budget that was allocated to send patients outside of Tanzania and outside of Africa. And this was an amazing thing, particularly when the COVID pandemic hit, because it meant that the whole issue of sending patients out was not really an option. What we have seen and what we have seen with our governments doing in Tanzania is not unique to Tanzania. We work with partners in Ghana, in Nigeria, and what has been happening in the health sector in all these countries is the investment in centers of excellence for health, for academia, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and research institutions, which means that now there is the physical infrastructure to provide health services, to train people and to retain people so that we address the whole issue of brain drain. With regards to digital infrastructure, so just to go back to the Center of Excellence in academia and research, the World Bank has invested considerably with African centers of excellence across the spectrum in terms of health and biomedical sciences. And what this means is that when you're having technical cooperations with Brazil, other Latin American countries, or countries in Europe and North America, it means that we're able to conduct cutting-edge research from Africa because we've got the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is in place. In terms of the human resources, we have people who have been trained and are now able to stay within their countries and conduct research or participate in research. And then the third is the digital infrastructure. And again, most African countries, and I think one of the problems of countries in Africa is that we don't do a very good job of saying what we've done, is that there has been considerable investment in digital infrastructure. And this is not something that has happened in the past 5 years. This has really been happening in the past 15, 20 years. And what we have seen working in genomics is really the capacity to access high performance computing facilities, to be able to analyze data where you have colleagues working here in Tanzania working at Sanger Institute in the UK, Broad Institute in the US, South Africa, and we're all able to analyze genotype, phenotype data. And here we're talking about big data in a way that we would not have been able to do if there hadn't been that investment. Now, what this does is that it really means that when it comes to partnership, the partnership is more equitable than it was previously. And I think funders are seeing this and seeing the importance of this. And when you look at funding institutions, whether it's the NIH, what they're doing is that they're saying, rather than give funding to an institution in the north or north, we will give the funding to the institutions in the south, and then they will decide who they work with, how they work with, and what are their priorities. And this has really, really transformed, one, the health sector, secondly, the academic and research or academic and scientific sector, and really with data, and this is something that, with data, this is something that we're able to do, and we're able to participate in ways that we have not been able to do. And I think it's worth looking at that, because what this means is that whether we want to respond to a health pandemic like COVID-19, whether we want to respond to climate change, whether we want to respond to agricultural innovations, it means that we have the capacity to do that here. And if we don't, we will be able to develop the discussion that will allow us to have equitable discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I mean, this is a great cue to go back to you, Amit. I mean, Julie spoke about equitable cooperation, and then we were talking about Mexico and Brazil and Argentina, for example, having big lab capacity, among other things. But now, as Julie was saying, Africa can have it has a lot of know-how and research capacity. So how can we, going back to your point, how can we make this more fluid?
Yeah, sorry about dropping up earlier where we had a connection issue. The way to make it more fluid is literally have deeper cooperation between both public and private sector. So there are two main focuses in healthcare in Africa, and they're equally weighty. The private sector is an amazing sector which is flourishing, right from SMEs to those in the rural and far distant areas. And we also have the public sector. So sometimes we need to be very careful about how we're managing our relation with both. And then we need to identify what is necessary and what's required in Africa to deepen the relation in, say, healthcare. So in the Brazil-Africa healthcare situation, we know that there are 6 main key areas where we need $30 billion of new investments. And lots of studies have shown that after the pandemic, the 3 key focus areas is what will make Africa move to the next level, and cooperation and collaboration in those would be clear. Digital technologies of health, we've talked about it here clearly, and finding the right application, the right kind of solutions at the right price in languages that are also well understood, because remember, we have Francophone and we have Anglophone Africa, and there are many other. So language, cultural, and how to deepen that would be a very important pillar number 1. The other 2 bubbles before I talk about, one is local manufacturing, and the other is supply chain and logistics. So $30 billion will be spread around the 6 areas, but these 3 were key. Healthcare provision, affordable care, and then of course health insurance, which is around UHC, and finally human resources for health. With the 78.9 billion private equity investments in health globally, Africa received 152 million in 2019. So it shows that it's a small percent, but the trend over the last few years has been rising. So for Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, I think understanding the local content on what's required will foster greater relationships, greater investments, and more importantly, not to sell what you have, but to give what Africa needs. And in the same way, what Africa can send out to Latin America, making it a two-way situation, is what will define a long-lasting relation. Let's look at India, for example. I mean, I was born in Africa. I've done business in Africa. I've been here for the last plenty of years. But India, Africa, what they did, they flipped it quite differently. And they said that if we are getting 95% of the medical travelers from Africa going to India, should we carry on this trend or should we do South-to-South cooperation? So they put a 4-step model to improve bilateral relationships between India and Africa. That's bearing fruit. Packaged medication, capacity building, skill transfer, research and development. So to really answer the question is, collaboration between the countries must take cognizance of both public and private. I think that's key point I'm talking about. We have a private sector federation in Africa. We have a private sector in Germany. We have a private sector in Japan. We have in India. We've been collaborating. So I first need to have engagement with the private health sector in Brazil. Non-existent. The private health sector in Argentina. Non-existent. The private health sector in Mexico. Non-existent. So it really creates an opportunity, great opportunity for us to start working with these countries to improve it. I speak because I know we do work with so many countries across the continent. And I think this call will lead into opportunities to work with many countries in Latin America. And I hope to see that bring forward, at least with the private sector face. I hope that's useful.
Thank you very much, Amit. I mean, as a Latin American myself, I was born and raised in Argentina. I cannot agree more with you. I mean, we have a lot to learn from Africa. I mean, the Africa CDC, for example, this year has set an example to a lot of people. But anyway, before getting into pontification, Caroline, I think now we are going to open, let's say, the floor to questions from the audience. We have about 10 or 15 minutes to take a few questions from those who are interested in going deeper with the speakers. Carol?
Our panelists are hearing me. Can you hear me, Andres, right now, Adriana, Jennifer?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So starting with a question for Adriana. Is it possible for us to keep seeing this change, geopolitical change for the past 5 years? I mean, growing presence of China and less presence of Brazil in cooperation with Africa?
Hi, thank you for the question. I think that, first of all, to bring your question to the immediate, regardless of who wins the U.S. elections, Biden or Trump, we are going to continue seeing a rivalry between the United States and China due to structural factors, because most of the reasons behind this rivalry, they precede even the Trump government. And this has, we already know, an impact not only in Latin America, but also in Africa. Here in Brazil, for instance, the American government announced that its Exim Bank had signed a memorandum of understanding to offer perhaps 1 billion in opportunities in infrastructure, especially digital infrastructure, as long as Brazil bans Huawei from its 5G. And so I think, we're going to continue to see major power dynamics shape internal events and choices that are made. But of course, there's always an interaction. I'm not being deterministic. The geopolitics, it inevitably interacts with national and subnational institutions. And sometimes there's a mutual learning process that then yields different outcomes. But I think, yes, we have to expect this to happen. As for Brazil's presence and more than presence, for its ability to cooperate, I think it will depend on the next government, because right now what I see is that there are technical teams within different parts of the Brazilian government that are familiar and that value technical and scientific cooperation, but the extent to which they're able to implement cooperation policies and projects is very much restricted by the decisions that are taking place at the federal level. That's why I emphasize that during this period that we're living through, it's very important that universities, even though they're under attack here in Brazil, especially public universities, think tanks like ours, our Plataforma CIPÓ, just had a conversation yesterday with the Elman Institute, which is in Mogadishu. It turns out that we have a lot to talk about, for instance, when it comes to climate and security. Subnational governments, the C40 Alliance of Mayors, I think is a really interesting space that has been working on climate and adaptation in urban settings and is a natural space for exchanges. And then at some point, as long as we're able to keep this conversation alive, we'll be able to influence governments so that the official channels for cooperation can be reestablished or even boosted and improved based on the kind of dialogue that we're having here. But geopolitics will never go away. There is a race for resources. Some of it will be influenced by the pandemic. There's a new drive, for instance, on the part of China to ensure its food security and its energy security. Part of that strategy has to do with fomenting homegrown kind of domestic level capacity, but China has limits on that capacity, especially on the agricultural front. So it's going to seek out new partnerships and not always symmetrical partnerships in order to ensure that core interest. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you, Adriana. Maybe for Jennifer, this next one from Marvin Tabi. Collaboration and knowledge and skills transfer in the bioenergy economy will help Africa leapfrog and play a huge role in the energy transition. Your thought in this comment, Jennifer, about energy transition and bioenergy, is Marvin correct?
Well, I mean, I absolutely would agree. And as I think it was Adriana said earlier, this is one of the areas that Brazil can actually learn from Africa. And I know I just returned from working at the African Development Bank for a number of years. And it was fascinating to see what was happening in individual countries. Because, the African countries have sun, they have wind, they have water, they have all of these things that can be harnessed. And it's really a question of, putting the resources behind that sort of effort. On top of it, if you combine it together with sustainability concerns, and if you talk about the Great Green Wall, for example, that Adriana was mentioning earlier, which is really important. I mean, the idea is you can build that, but unless you have energy that can be produced and used in African countries that are all along the Sahel, then it will become a pile of firewood over time because people need energy. And so understanding that, I mean, at the African Development Bank, but others are also working at that, they're looking at how do you harness this incredible power he was talking about one particular type of renewable energy, but all of the renewable energies, so that you can ensure that all of these people who right now really do not have access to light and all power and all of the things that really are required to power an economy, that they will be actually and cooperation is needed for this, right? This isn't something that 54 individual African countries can do on their own. And this is another area where I think Africa will be a huge powerhouse, particularly if the efforts to create the single market or the African continental free trade area is going to make a huge difference in terms of that sort of collaboration. And, kind of also related to something that Amit was saying, when you look at technical collaboration and all these efforts, policy is hugely important. None of this is happening in a vacuum. And I think quite often it is neglected sometimes when you're looking at how do you train people up? How do you get them ready to deal with these things? How do you transfer the technologies? But if you don't have the supportive environment, if you don't have the cooperation, if you don't have all of these things, it's very hard to make it happen. But the short answer is yes, I do believe so. And I think it's going to be across multiple areas of renewable energy and sustainable energy sources.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. Maybe the next one for Amit. This is from Marcel Metbo. Africa today needs a partnership based on the principles of equitable share of rights, functions, and responsibilities. Is it possible to achieve, Amit?
Yes, it's definitely possible to achieve. And I think the transformation, especially in leadership in Africa, has been phenomenal over the last decade. I can assure you that if you were to do business 20 years ago, and what you will be able to do now is dramatically different. We can say that because we live here and we know that this transformation is rising Africa. It will be equitable. It will be, many times it'll be honest. You may still stumble along the way, but you will find reliable partners in many places in Africa, and you will find leaders who will be very fair in managing partnerships. Local content and understanding how you make this business work in Africa is important, but it will be equitable, it will be fair, you will see robustness. You might find challenges sometimes in how tenders are being floated in African countries. There may be a few frustrations, but I think a fair price, fair trade, and the vibrancy of the private sector is literally taking Africa to the next level. That's why you've seen so many countries around the world creating links. You'll be even surprised with government leadership. Some of them are sterling. Some of the partners that you see in Ministry of Health are doing a great job. Andrea has talked about Africa CDC, so did Jennifer. You will see some institutional strengthening that's taking place, that it's no longer an individual. So it is possible to have partnerships in Africa that's equitable, fair, and you can enjoy this cordial business relationship that will see future increasingly thrive as we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. We have received just a comment from Jorge Jaro. He is agreeing with Andres, actually, saying that rescue science is fundamental to rescue humanity also. I don't know if maybe Dr. Julie can add some insights on the role of science nowadays, because we are living in a moment that science can be ignored anymore. So we'd love to hear from Dr. Julie on this.
Thank you very much. So I think that I'm obviously biased in that I think science is absolutely critical for almost all the sectors that we've discussed this. And I think the point that Amit has made about the importance of public-private partnership, I think is worth reiterating, that this is extremely vital in all the sectors that we work in. When you have partnerships between the private sector and the public sector, I think this stands a greater chance of us achieving what it is that we want to achieve, whether this is in health, whether this is in agriculture or energy. I think the other aspect is the leapfrogging, and in terms of the question to Jennifer, and I think Africa has the opportunity to leapfrog in a lot of areas. Looking in the health sector, we have, and this is one of the things that we're working on in terms of curing or finding a cure, for instance, for sickle cell disease, rather than go through the points of finding disease-modifying medicines or finding solutions for bone marrow transplant. We would just like to leapfrog all of that and go and see, is there a possibility of us finding, being able to have in vivo gene therapy to cure sickle cell disease. And we have the technology available, the will, the political will, as well as the partnerships in order for us to do that by leapfrogging and being able to do things that mean that we don't have to go through all the steps that other countries have gone through, but it means that we can find solutions in health, in science and technology, in the various sectors that people are interested in order to bring benefits to the majority of people. Thank you.
Perfect, Dr. Julie. Thank you very much. I don't know if Andres has some points to highlight at this moment.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to the audience for the great questions, and thank you to all of you, Jennifer, Adriana, Amit, and Julie. I think the conclusion is, to both sides of the Atlantic, talk, listen, teach, be humble, and just push through because this is needed. And I think I always like to quote a great British comedian who died a couple of years ago, was Albert Finney, and he said that the secret to riches is the same as the secret to comedy, and that is timing. And I hope this is the right time for Latin America and Africa to actually talk to each other more, cooperate, and listen to each other. Thank you very much to every one of you. Thank you very much, Carolina, and thank you very much to the Brazil-Africa Forum and to the Brazil Institute for this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. To Dr. Julie, Andres, Adriana, Jennifer. This was a very fruitful panel. We appreciate your comments. Thank you very much. And keep following the forum because we have a full agenda today and tomorrow. Thank you very much, our dearest panelists.